Poverty is not just the absence of money, but the absence of opportunity. And the United States is a country where you have both freedom and abundant opportunities. And moving to the United States has given me both. I grew up in Lagos, Nigeria. I came from a close knitted family. I was the third of four children. And the best thing that my parents gave me was the gift of education. Even though I came from a poor family, they gave me education with the instruction that this is the tool that will help me to dig my way out of poverty and ignorance. But what my parents did was that they instilled in us the value of faith, hard work, and not giving up. They made us realize that if you put in the work, you will definitely get the reward. I came without a dime in my pocket. All I had was big dreams, determination to succeed, and the resilience. I got my first job at the age of 14. My job was on a construction site. My duties were to move concrete on a large pan from one end of the construction site to another one. I worked on that day from around 6 in the morning to about 7 at night. At the end of the day, the employer refused to pay me. And the reason was because she did not authorize the foreman to hire me. So I worked from sunup to sundown and didn't get paid. That tore up my spirit. And from that moment on, I decided that I was going to become a lawyer. And I was going to use every ounce of strength within me to fight against injustice, regardless of how powerful the opponent is. I am a man that worked my way up from nothing. I know what it means to feel like you're being unfairly treated, and I'm the person that can stand up to opponents regardless of how big or how powerful they are. Welcome to this episode of Legal Angle with Emmanuel Olawale. My guest today is Andria Noble. She is an attorney who has worked as a prosecutor that advocates for victims of domestic violence. She's currently an attorney with the Columbus City Attorney's Office in the litigation department, where she is in court most of the time, especially in federal court. Welcome to the show, Andrea.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I'm glad to be here.
Can you tell us a bit more about yourself?
Well, my name is Andria Noble, and I am actually from the East Coast. I was born in Massachusetts and raised in Maryland. I moved to Columbus, Ohio to pursue my legal education. I went to Capital University Law School. And from that point on, I fell in love with the city and found my husband and decided to stay here in Columbus. We, well, not in Columbus exactly, but in the Columbus area. We live in Franklin County. And, this city is really quite great, and we're glad to be here. And I've worked with the Columbus City Attorney's Office since 2008 while I was still in law school. I worked as an intern and as an intake officer before getting my law degree and passing the bar. And then I moved to become a prosecutor in 2011. At that point, I was just doing general prosecuting. And then at some point, I was able to get onto the domestic violence team where we specialize in domestic violence and assault cases or domestic violence and stalking cases. In that time, we prosecute solely those cases. We have a far smaller docket as a domestic violence prosecutor because those cases require a lot more attention and work with various individuals and victims. A lot of the other cases don't have the same amount of people you need to speak to, so there are you have fewer cases. After a while. In 2019, I was offered the position to move to the litigation department of the city attorney's office, and I've been there since 2019. And I do handle times when the city of Columbus is sued. Outside of my legal work, I am the co-president of the Columbus Bar Association Alliance, where we fundraise for different nonprofit or organizations in Columbus, Ohio, including Choices and Amethyst, the CASA of Franklin County, and similar organizations. And I also do some donating and charity work on my own time as well. And I'm just very excited to be running for judge. I've had the opportunity to practice in front of a number of different judges, and I think that it's really important the way that people speak, the way that judges speak to individuals, and how their words come across. And I want to make sure that each individual that comes into a courtroom is treated with compassion and empathy. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. And I think it is really important that individuals are treated like a person and that their cases are considered on an individual basis. And that's why I'm running for judge.
Thank you. And I understand you are a first generation Portuguese American. Do you speak or understand Portuguese?
Unfortunately, I do not speak Portuguese anymore. I was born in New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is a small, well, I feel like it's a small town, but it's probably not a small town anymore. But it has a pretty big Portuguese population. And when I was there, you know, I always like to say my first language was Portuguese, but I probably didn't speak many words because I was pretty small when we moved out of that town and moved in with an English speaking family. And my mom wanted to respect them and not make them feel like they were kind of strangers in their own homes by us not speaking the language they understood. So if you ask her still to this day, she says that's her biggest regret because she really wishes that my sister and I both were fluent or at least competent in the language. I can pick up certain words and I know how to say pretty much every family member because I refer to all my aunts and uncles as tias and tius, and my grandparents are vava and vavu. My kids call my father and stepmother vava and vavu because they're still in that town. They call my mom mom at this point, but they call them vava and vavu, and we kind of keep those family names. But other than that, I don't know much. My sister is she was older than me, so she can pick up on it a little better than I can, but
Yeah.
whenever I've been to Portugal twice and my grandparents speak a mile a minute and I'm just like, I don't know what you're saying.
It's understand. What was it in New England?
I'm sorry, what was that question?
What was it like growing up in Massachusetts?
So I moved from Massachusetts when I was 8, I think, right after second grade. And you know, at that point I grew up in a single parent home. At that point, my mom and my dad divorced when I was pretty young. We were living with friends for a little bit, and then we moved in with just the friend at that point. And you know, it was pretty good. It's a little different there. I don't really remember a whole lot. I just remember having to walk to school in snow that was as tall as I am. And I love this. I love Massachusetts, and I love being near the water and the Cape. And unfortunately, it's a lot harder to get back there now when you have to lug 2 children with you.
I know what that feels like. And what was it like for you to move to Massachusetts to Maryland when you were a bit older? What was that transition like for you as a kid?
It was difficult for me. I didn't want to move. I remember in my 3rd grade class picture, I have this very large Boston Red Sox shirt on because I wanted everyone to know that I was from Massachusetts and that I was not from there. And so it was difficult to kind of get away from your family and get away from, what at in second grade. But kids are pretty resilient, and I made a bunch of friends, and I love Maryland as well. It's really kind of interesting because you have the coast, the plains, and the mountains all in one state, and can kind of go to so many different places. I remember in high school being able to take day trips to New York City as a field trip for high school, and being able to go to Washington, D.C. And I didn't appreciate how lucky I was to be able to do all of those things until I moved to Columbus. And, you drive 2 hours, you're still in Ohio. And when you drive 2 hours in Maryland, you're likely in a different state.
Like in New York, New Jersey, or so do you miss Maryland?
There are times that I miss it. We used to always be out on the water and going to Ocean City and things of that nature. And so I kind of joke that I'm landlocked here, and it's very weird to not be able to just be sitting out at a beach or getting on a boat and riding around. I used to water ski and stuff like that, and I'm not sure if I could do that anymore because it's been so long since I've done it. So it was a little transition to come out here to Ohio, but I've really, grown to love it. And there's so much culture, and the food here is amazing because you can get, different varieties of food from all over the world and great authentic versions of it all around Columbus. And I love to eat around the world. So I love that part.
Then, when you went to college, you decided to study psychology and criminal justice. Why those two areas?
So I watched way too much Law and Order as a kid, and I wanted to be BD Wong. I wanted to be a forensic psychologist. I thought his job was so fascinating that he was kind of in this area of working to figure out why people committed crimes. And I've always been fascinated by that aspect. Why are people committing crimes, the crimes they commit? Um, Once I got to college, I realized an actual career path in psychology wasn't exactly going to work for me. And so I kind of switched and did the next best thing, which was becoming a lawyer. And I've always wanted to be a prosecutor and advocating for the state. So that's when I kind of stuck with just mostly the criminology, criminal justice stuff, and went to law school with that. So, and as a prosecutor, you're kind of doing the same thing, just not with the psychology background of why are people committing the crimes that they're committing, and what can we do to kind of change that and help them out.
Did you have a moment in time or a period in time when you realized that you wanted to become a lawyer? Or is it just something you fell into?
I remember sitting in high school talking to like mentors and telling them that I wanted to be a forensic psychologist, and talking to them about that. And they looked at me and they were like, "Well, have you ever thought about being a lawyer?" And I kind of said, I had never thought about it. And I'm sure much to the chagrin of my mom, I'm really good at arguing. And and we had that a lot as a kid. So, at least now I'm doing it for good instead of just getting on my mom's nerves. So that kind of got it into my head. And while I was in college, once I realized that I didn't want to do psychology, it almost immediately clicked that I wanted to do law.
That's amazing. Now you are getting paid to argue, you're not arguing for free.
Yes.
And what brought you to Ohio? You haven't told us that.
So I received a partial scholarship to Capital University Law School. And so that made that decision to come to Capital University and move to Columbus that kind of made the decision for me. And I came to visit, and at that time, airfare was only like 39 or $49 each way from on Southwest to get back and forth from home. It's only like a 7-hour drive, so it wasn't too dreadful to try to travel back and forth. Now airfare is a bit more expensive, but so it kind of made that easier to be a little bit away from home so I could focus on studying and kind of branching out, but also be close enough that when I needed it, when I got homesick, it wasn't too expensive to get back.
Wow. So that's why you decided to come to Capital. So the law school brought you to Ohio,
Yes.
just like me. So after you went to Capital Law School, you decided not to go back. The law school brought you in. Why didn't you go back?
So I met my husband here and fell in love with him and the city. And it I started working at the Columbus City Attorney's Office and really ingraining myself into the city. And it never occurred to me to try to leave once I became a part of the community.
So school brought you to Ohio. Love made you stay.
Yep.
That's awesome. Then you started working for the city attorney's office as a prosecutor, prosecuting sexual assault, domestic violence cases.
And not sexual assault, but domestic violence cases and stalking cases. After a few years as a general courtroom prosecutor, I was able to focus solely on domestic violence cases.
Yeah. And what made you decide to focus on cases like that? Was it something that was assigned to you, or was it something that you gravitated to?
When I first started at the prosecutor's office, they had, and they still have, the domestic violence unit. And that's a team of people that focus solely on domestic violence cases. But at the time that I started, some of the domestic violence cases would stay with the general courtroom prosecutor. So we got an experience of them. In my first full year as a prosecutor, I had one of those cases that ended up going to trial. And uh, it was a situation where the victim wanted the domestic violence charge and a bunch of conditions, and the defendant wanted a disorderly conduct for time served. So we were kind of at a crossroads, and we decided to try the case. And it was a situation where, there were no other witnesses, it was just them. And we ended up having a jury trial, and we played the 911 call. And myself and the advocate assigned to this case had listened to that 911 call probably 100 times each. But the jury picked up on something that we completely missed, and that was that they heard the defendant's voice in the 911 call, and when he took the stand, he had said he wasn't there when she called 911, and we ended up getting a guilty conviction. And I remember about a week or so later getting a thank you card from that victim about how much it meant to her for me to stand up for her and let her have her day in court and try the case. And at that point, I remember walking into my boss's office, who's a mentor, an amazing person. And I said, I know I'm not ready right now, but I want to be on the domestic violence team at some point. Those cases, they hit differently. I became very passionate about them at that point.
Yeah, thank you. Because advocating for victims of domestic violence will take a lot out of you. You have to have that emotional connection to them, to their pain, at least for you to be able to advocate on their behalf. So, how do you handle cases where after you have all the facts and the victim doesn't want to proceed, saying that they want to drop the charges?
Those are some of the most difficult cases, especially when, unfortunately, we have that happen where the person has been in front of us a bunch of times. And so you you just kind of have to try your best. You look to see if you can prosecute the case without them. You look to see if you can find something else that they might want. What is it that they would want, even if it's not the conviction? And is it just having the individual go through some counseling? Is it having them stay away? What are some alternative resolutions that you can do? So it's always more difficult when they no longer want to prosecute the case. Unfortunately, we tell them a lot. It's not their direct decision anymore. Once the police have filed a domestic violence charge, it's the state versus the defendant, not the victim versus the defendant. So they don't have the ownership of, I want to dismiss this case, so I'm dismissing it. And it's probably, sometimes I like to say it's better, because it's then the state is the one that's doing everything, not the victim. But we've had situations where the victim comes on day one and says, I want to dismiss this case. And then on day 45, they're saying, no, actually, I want a conviction. I want this. I want to ask for a bunch of things. So it kind of allows some space and time between the incident and allowing the victim to have the opportunity to process what has happened to them and what they want. And the advocates of our office are amazing and reach out to them so many times and talk to them about resources that they can use for themselves, if they need time to get away, if they need to go to Choices, the Franklin County Domestic Violence Shelter, or the only domestic violence shelter in Franklin County. So it is very difficult to have to deal with the situations where they decide they no longer want to pursue charges. Sometimes we would pursue them without their presence, and sometimes we were unable to do that.
I can see how that can happen. And because domestic violence is an intimate crime. It's something that is between either married partners, dating partners, or people that they live with. So you have a situation where maybe there's an issue of domestic violence, but then because of the bond between the couple or the people, they have a problem going forward with the case. So in a situation like that, while in between when the crime allegedly happened, and by the time you are ready to prosecute, they have some kind of reconciliation. How does that come to play? And they're like, no, I don't want my husband to go to jail. No, I don't want my boyfriend or girlfriend to spend a day in jail. How do you handle that?
So a lot of times the domestic violence case charges, sometimes they would end up with a heavy jail sentence, and sometimes they would actually end up with just putting them on probation. So that's when myself and the advocate would talk to the victim. All right, we understand you don't want jail time. What about, do they need to stay away from alcohol or drugs? Do they need a mental health screen, an assessment? Do they need to become med compliant with whatever they might already have diagnosed? Do they need to have any sort of anger management or domestic violence counseling? And we ask them those types of questions. And a lot of times we're able to craft a resolution that gets them what they might think that the defendant might need. And so that's usually how we would handle that, is to try to figure out, look, we get you don't want him or her to be in jail. What is it that would be helpful? And sometimes they'll still say nothing. They're fine. We're fine. Nothing needs to happen. And we will kind of take a look at what we're able to see and decide, all right, well, we're going to at least have them screened to see if they need any sort of domestic violence counseling, or we see that there's alcohol or drug abuse in this individual's past. So let's get them, let's have no alcohol or drugs as a condition, make them have random drug screens to make sure that they're complying and things of that nature.
And what constitutes domestic violence? What are the elements of that?
So domestic violence is an assault of a family member or an intimate partner. So it could be a parent-child relationship. It could be a sibling relationship. It could be married or living together, and intimate partners. There's a bunch of different ways to kind of prove that one. If they share a child together, that's going to also be a domestic violence situation. So there has to be some connection that shows that they are some sort of family relationship.
Does the assault have physical or verbal assault?
So there are both. There is the domestic violence where it is a physical assault, where they actually put their hands on the individual, and that can be either a misdemeanor or a felony, depending on the defendant's prior record or how whether or not there's a broken bone. There might be some other conditions that some other serious injuries that occur would make it a felony. And then there's also a fourth degree misdemeanor domestic violence where it is threatening violence to that individual, to a family member. If you're threatening to kill somebody without actually putting your hands on them, it can still be a domestic violence charge.
Thank you. And what differentiates the misdemeanor domestic violence and felony domestic violence?
The misdemeanor is the felony. To become a felony, there needs to be either a prior domestic violence charge against an individual or a serious injury, how the revised code handles that. So it's generally broken bones are usually a felony offense. And then sometimes some other situations will count as a serious injury.
Okay. But what situation where there is a violence but never done and never keep track? Would that be deemed to be domestic violence?
I'm sorry, you cut out during that question.
Yeah, my question was in a situation where the threatens to use a gun, they never produce the gun. And there's that kind of, like I'm gonna kill you, like that. We can use our charges for domestic.
Yes, all you have to do is threaten the person, and the person believe that threat. So you can you don't have to show a weapon. You can just verbally say, or I mean, in text messages or voicemails where you're not directly there. Those can sometimes be construed as the domestic violence threats as well.
Okay. And maybe domestic violence involving children. Are there domestic violence charges now for assaulting their parents?
If there are, they aren't handled in municipal court, so I never handled those. I did have situations where, an 18 to 21-year-old still living at home was charged with domestic violence against their parents. Those are tricky as well because the parents usually don't want their kids to be getting in trouble, and usually just want to kind of get their kid on the right path. And so those types of cases are also ripe for what conditions can we do to try to get this person the help that they need so that this doesn't become a problem long term.
Okay. Does your office at the time offer some kind of counseling or therapy for victims or families involved in this kind of situation?
So our office has advocates that work with the victim and talk to them about their resources. We don't have direct therapy in our office, but they would refer them to whatever type of resources they might need. Choices, domestic violence shelter was one of them that would frequently come up, and I believe they have therapy and counseling sessions there. And there's also a few other classes and organizations around Columbus that would be referred to by the advocate to the victim so that they could seek out the assistance that they might need.
Thank you. Because domestic violence is very intimate and it happens in close quarters, and most times there are no other witnesses. But then in situations where you have two divergent stories, but you decide to prosecute anyway, how do you navigate those difficulties where it's even hard to tell who's telling the truth?
That's very difficult, and you kind of look at other things that might help you figure out what happened. If the individual is indicating that they were punched in the face a bunch and had like restrained, bruises and things of that nature to kind of help corroborate that story, it's harder to put that up in front of a jury and get a conviction. But if they're saying that and you see a busted lip, a swollen eye, and bruises around their arms, it looks a lot more like that individual is telling the truth. So you have to look at the other evidence to see. The 911 calls, like that other case, can be very telling. Sometimes they're on the phone at the same time as when a threat is happening or when an assault is happening. And that evidence can kind of help bring the story together and allow whoever the fact finder is and for our office to see what happened there. Nobody's going to be able to tell us for sure because we weren't there, but if we can kind of piece together the story through all the other evidence, it helps to figure out what happened.
Have you ever had a situation where the defendant has a credible defense for what do we call it? Self-defense, where they're like, "Oh, I didn't start this. I was only defending myself," but then he filed his charges.
We have had situations where the whom we believe is the victim is actually named as the defendant. We've also had situations where the police couldn't figure it out and they charged both sides. So
Really? How do you handle that?
we get a special prosecutor to handle one of them and we handle the other, because it wouldn't be fair to either side if we were prosecuting both sides. If we were prosecuting both sides, the victim on one is also our defendant, so we wouldn't be able to talk to them. And so we would always a special prosecutor whenever they file against both individuals that are there. And so if we have a real credible reason to believe that the victim is actually the named defendant, we would often work with their attorney to figure out a way to work that out. There's actually a Choices has a victim counseling program. And so I, a number of times, had the named defendant go to that victim's counseling and then ended up getting their case dismissed. So it is interesting. And this is why it's so important, I think, to have a good working relationship with the defense bar, because you want them to be able to feel like they can come to you and say, we really think that this is the victim and here's why.
Thank you. And apart from prison time and probation, are there terms of recommended sentencing for defendants?
Well, you have to look at each case individually, but a lot of times we would want them to at least get a general counseling assessment to see what's going on and if there is anything that's needed. So do they need domestic violence counseling? Do they need drug counseling? Do they have a mental health issue that needs to be addressed? So a lot of times we would put that in there just so that way somebody who is experienced in figuring that out looks at the individual as an individual and determines whether or not they need any of these additional train or counseling sessions. Some of the other things that we would do would be a stay away order. We've had people that would have a GPS monitor on their ankles, so that way we would give them either, very rarely would they be under house arrest, traditional house arrest, where they're not allowed to go anywhere except their house, but rather would be prevented from or told to stay away from the victim's area. So like the victim's work, the victim's house, maybe the victim's children's schools, things of that nature. And that way, if they crossed into those zones, it would be considered a probation violation. But in addition to that, the victim is called to be informed that the individual is violating the terms.
Thank you. Have you ever had a situation where you have a stay away order between a couple or a family, But then while that was ongoing, they went behind your back to reconcile, and the victim comes back to ask you to approach the court to lift the order.
Yes,
And how
that's
did that turn out?
sometimes we often would allow the victim to make that request on his or her own behalf to the court and allow the court to make that determination. Our office, depending on the circumstances, sometimes we would object and say we don't agree with this, and sometimes we would say, you know, we'll leave it up to the court. And then ultimately it's the court's decision as to whether or not to keep that stay away order or not.
Thank you. And is domestic violence gender specific?
No, it is not. While the majority of our cases were a male defendant with a female victim, we have had all sorts of family relationships and genders. It crosses the genders. So it is a problem sometimes with us that have done it for a long time to refer to the defendant as he and refer to the victim as she. It takes a lot of work to remember it doesn't matter, and that the victim could be any gender and the defendant can be any gender.
In your own experience, do you have more more women as victims than men, or is it almost 50-50?
In my personal experience, it was predominantly women victims and it was predominantly men defendants. So that's my personal experience. But I have also had men as victims and women as defendants, where they were the true defendants and the true victims.
In situations where you have same-sex relationships, how does that affect how you prosecute these domestic violence cases?
It doesn't. We treat that just the same. If a same-sex couple has similar a power imbalance in particular, we're going to treat that just as any other case, and we are going to look at the facts and determine what specific needs that case should have.
Is there a relationship between stalking and domestic violence?
Yes. Most of the time, most stalking cases, not all, there was an intimate relationship involved either before or during the stalking. There are some times where that's not the case, but the vast majority of the cases I handled, there was a relationship, some sort of relationship that led to that that stalking.
What is the legal definition of stalking?
I would have to look that up because it has been over 3 years since I've done
Yeah.
that.
No, just the general definition. It doesn't have to be the revised code.
So
Understanding of it.
if my memory serves, it is I think like 3 different contacts that were unwanted, and it could range in whether it's like text messages or following, things of that nature. But it's been a while since I've had to do that one.
How about harassment? Does it have any relationship to domestic violence?
What harassment is kind of vague. So like telephone harassment, do you mean like a telephone harassment?
Just generally, because people use those words interchangeably, so you can break it down so that they can have an understanding.
Okay,
Because yes,
so yeah, I mean, there is often harassment in domestic violence cases, and that could be verbally, it could be constantly texting or calling when the person doesn't want them to be. And those are types of harassment. In addition, there can be, contacting friends or family members or employers and kind of interfering in that space. or something that was happening kind of towards the end of my time as a prosecutor was a lot of revenge porn, which is also a type of harassment where people are, sending pornographic materials of an individual to places that that individual wouldn't want them to be, whether that's putting it online for everyone to see or sending it to friends, family, or employers. And that is another form of harassment.
Do you prosecute that?
I'm not sure if there's been a change in the law since I started, or since I left. We very rarely, we would started to see it, and I think, unfortunately, I don't remember if we were prosecuting them. I never had one myself, so I don't want to speak for the whole office on whether or not it's something our office handles or something that the county prosecutor's office would handle.
In a situation where domestic violence has been filed, is pending, the perpetrator and now started stalking them, additional domestic violence, or just stay away of her?
It depends on what the actions are. So if it violates the actual stalking code section, then we could do that. If it is not, then it would be a probation or a bond violation, and we would approach the court and ask for potentially for the person to end up being remanded and put back into jail during the pendency of the case, since they cannot follow court orders to stay away from the victim.
What happened in a situation with the family, their children, and there's a stay away order for the defendant, and there's this plea that, I want to stay this order is going to keep me away from kids. Do you use the court give them some kind of visitation that will give them children, while they have to stay away from the victim, which will be the
So we had to sometimes navigate this. Our office would not get in the weeds as to, okay, the defendant can have the kids on Mondays and Wednesdays from these hours. If the kids were not a part of the stay away order and they were of an age where you could kind of work with it, we would sometimes talk about a third party, going through a third party and saying, look, going through a third party to communicate about when they can see the kids is not going to be a violation of the stay away order, provided that it is about when they're going to see the kids, and not, okay, but also tell victim, I'm watching her or him, so as long as it stayed within the parameters, we would sometimes do that. And that would be the sort of cleanest way to deal with, parent one wanting to see the kids, but having a stay away order against them for person two. So we would never get into the weeds of actually figuring out when there would be some parenting time.
Thank you. And while you were in college, you were involved in the university's judiciary. Tell us about that.
So it was a 5-person panel where we would listen to usually potential criminal misconduct, but it was a violation of the student code. A lot of that is also a violation of the criminal code, but sometimes it's as simple as a plagiarism charge or cheating charge. Those are less of a scary thing to kind of be looking at as a college student. And so we did that a little bit. They had a specialized group for that. I was on the general one, so anytime they violated the code, whether that was throwing a party or other things, I had one case where the individual was charged with punching a professor, and so it was really interesting. You got to sit and it was like a 5-panel set of judges / prosecutors because we would get to ask questions, and we listened to all of the sides, and we would have to render a decision. And generally, we had to come to some sort of consensus. It just had to be a majority. It didn't have to be a unanimous decision. We would sit there after listening to everything and kind of talk through every aspect of what happened. And if we found that the individual did violate the code, we would and also have to indicate what we thought was an appropriate resolution. And some of those cases, the individuals had attorneys so that they could have their representation. And so it was a kind of a good look into what it's like to be in the legal system. It's far less formal, but it kind of gives you a brief glance into it.
And how did you get involved in that? How did you become a member of that judiciary?
I think I applied for it and got accepted, and then because I knew I wanted to be a lawyer, and then I also applied to be, now I'm forgetting the term, but the head for any of the panels. So I was kind of like the head panelist.
So even from college, you've always have this propensity to become a judge, and now
Yes.
you're running for the office. So what inspired you to seek this position you're running for?
So I think in my experience as an attorney, I've found that it's very important to treat each person that comes there like they're a person. And unfortunately, I've seen that not happen from judges. And so I decided it was important to be that judge, to show compassion to individuals. There's a situation, I was in front of a female judge for a period of time, and every time a young lady was charged with underage drinking, she would go on to tell them that they needed to be careful because they could be raped. Yet every time a young man came up with the same charge, she said nothing. When she would tell these young ladies this, it would be in a courtroom full of people. And all of those individuals are listening to this. And it is continuing this notion that the victim is to blame if something happens to them. And it's also potentially making that victim continue to internalize that same thought process. And so listening to that over and over again made me want to do better and be a better voice, and to provide each individual with compassion and understanding the weight of the words of a judge. And so that's why I decided to run for judge.
Court judge and female about the danger of drug and associated rape. How did that make you feel as a woman?
Angry. I was very angry. I remember the first time I heard it, just being completely shocked that it was happening. I made it very short. I said a one line sentence, but she would go on for a few minutes about how the people needed to be careful. And it really frustrates me, particularly for college age girls who are constantly told, it's your responsibility to be careful. It's your responsibility to make sure you know where your drink is. It's your responsibility to not wear clothes that might turn someone on. And it's your fault if you led them on. And what did you do? And to have the judge telling this young lady the same thing, it really hurt and made me angry, because we need to stop perpetuating the notion that the victim is to blame whenever they're the victim of a rape, whether or an assault or any other type of action. They're the victim and they're not to blame.
Was the court for and the kind of cases will be handled?
Yes, I am running for Franklin County Court of Common Pleas. I will be handling felony cases for the state of Ohio in Franklin County and any civil case that's over $15,000 in dispute.
And what kind of judge do you see yourself?
If I become a judge, I'm going to be a compassionate judge, and I'm going to take the time to listen to everyone that comes before me and make sure that they get the opportunity to tell their story. And I'm going to be fair and impartial.
People out there who are in this program, they might say, "Well, I'm not going to get trouble." Why? Can you tell them why voting for their judges?
Judges matter a lot because the type of judge that's on the bench is going to dictate the community. Judges that want to find the root of why an individual is committing a crime want to help help that person find what's going on and seek the help that they might need, so that way they don't continue to commit crimes in our community. I want to, and judges that are similarly minded want to uplift the people that are coming before us, so that way they can move forward outside of the criminal justice system. And that makes for a better community and a stronger community if these individuals are treated like people and are able to kind of break themselves free from, whether it's an addiction or mental health problem or food, and break away from that so that they can become a wonderful part of our community.
Thank you. How has your life experience, how do you think your life experience from decision has?
Well, I have I have a couple of different things in my background that allow for me to bring a different perspective on the bench. I come from a household. I had a single mom for a while, and then my mom did remarry, so I had a very loving stepdad. I have a loving stepmom and mother, or my father as well. And so that's part of it. We moved around a lot, and I was able to. We also went from being not as well off to being middle class, and so I've experienced a lot of differences in my life, and that allows me the opportunity to see where people are coming from in a different light than some other people might be able to. And I think that's important to have different backgrounds on the bench, so that way an individual can look at the bench and say, I can see myself somewhere on that bench.
Correct me if I'm wrong. What I'm hearing you say is your life experience as being raised by a single parent, being raised, moving around a lot as a kid, and having experienced poverty, then you moved up to being middle class, gives you a wide range of empathy for a wide range of people that you can understand where people are coming from because you had to dig your way up to and went through those hard stuff.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, thank you. And what makes you uniquely qualified for this position?
I have been a lawyer for over 11 years now. I have prosecuted cases, so I know what it's like to be on the criminal side. And I've also done civil cases, so I know what it's like to deal with the civil cases as well. I've had jury trials on both civil cases and on criminal cases. I've had probably dozens of jury trials, and I've had hundreds of motion hearings and court trials. I have run the gamut of the different types of motions I've had to write and draft or argue. And so I have the experience of doing all of that from the perspective of a lawyer. And I've also had the wonderful opportunity to practice in front of numerous judges and learn from them by being able to watch them and see how they they do what they're doing. And so that is what makes me uniquely qualified.
Do you have a particular judge that you want to emulate or that inspires you?
I like different aspects of a bunch of different judges. I've had that with the opportunity to serve in front of so many. To pick just one would be very difficult to do because each judge is unique, and it's always about learning from each of them as I continue to proceed.
Yeah. And what do you want voters to remember about you?
I want voters to remember that I think it is important that each individual is treated like a person and that they believe that they've had their time in court and they've had their voice heard.
And what does it mean to you to come on Legal Angle?
It is an honor and a privilege. I've had the opportunity to speak to you outside of this, and I know that this this opportunity is unique and it can reach different people that I might not necessarily get a chance to go and shake their hands. And it gives me the opportunity to talk about something that I'm passionate about. I don't get to do domestic violence and stalking cases anymore. So being able to speak about it here has been a great pleasure because it's a very important part of the criminal justice system. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak with you.
Thank you. And thank you also for taking the time to come on Legal Angle and educate our audience about domestic violence, prosecuting it, and the nuances and the things you do for victims. Thank you.
Thank you.
And for those of you watching us at home or listening to this as a podcast, thank you again for joining us. Stay tuned next week for another wonderful episode. And if you want to reach out to Andria, you can visit www.votenobleforjudge.com. Again, votenobleforjudge.com. Until next time, stay blessed. Bye for now.